Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the idea of thinking beyond this conversation. It's an application of an idea that struck me as I was reading a new book by Simon Sinek called The Infinite Game. And while I'm not going to review the book here in this podcast, I will say it's a really good book, and I suggest you get it if you're interested in leadership development and thinking about business and how you engage with people and how you run your business or how you run your team. The idea comes down to the distinction between a finite game and an infinite game. So I'll just quote from the book so we can use Sinek's words as a launching point for the main idea of this podcast episode. Here's what Simon Sinek says. In a finite game, the game ends when its time is up and the players live on to play another day, unless, of course, it was a duel. And in an infinite game, it's the opposite. It is the game that lives on, and it is the players whose time runs out. Because there is no such thing as winning or losing in an infinite game, the players simply drop out of the game when they run out of the will and resources to keep playing. And the idea that I'm advancing today with the idea of thinking beyond this conversation is that leaders view their conversations, their interactions, their communications with others more in light of an infinite game where the goal is to keep the game going than as a finite game where the goal is to win the encounter. It's an idea I've talked about in other places, written about in my blog, the idea of do you want to win the conversation or win the relationship? Do you want to resolve the conflict or prove that you're right? All of these ideas come back to the idea of playing the conversation or engaging in the conversation as if we're an infinite game with the goal of keeping it moving forward and living to engage another day, rather than a finite game where my goal is to win this encounter and possibly destroy the relationship. Well, let me give you a historical example to paint the picture of what an infinite game might look like or how an approach to an infinite game might look like. Now, I live in the United States, so U.S. history is kind of a big deal to me, and I'm going to tell the story of George Washington, our first president, the commanding general of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War period in U.S. history, and go back to 1775, when George Washington was the new commander-in-chief of the American Army. He faces Great Britain, and at the time, Great Britain was a country with the strongest credit and financial resources of any country in the world. They had a highly trained and professional army of superior numbers. They had arguably the strongest navy in the world. In fact, the British Empire was built primarily on the strength of its navy. America has virtually no navy for the first 3 years of this war. And many of the colonists, the people that are Washington's countrymen, sympathize with Great Britain. So in this case, his enemy. Now with that backdrop, let's look at some of his history. Between the summer of 1776 and the summer of 1778, so a 2-year period, he's fighting primarily along a 100-mile stretch of land between New York and Philadelphia, for the most part. During that time, he fights 7 major battles, and he loses 5. Frankly, it didn't look good for the U.S. forces. From our vantage point today, several hundred years later, we see that his approach actually helped him win the war. At the time, though, it looked like he was losing the war. He lost 5 of 7 major battles during a 2-year time frame. And he was quoted as saying, I'm going to paraphrase this a bit to bring it more into contemporary English terminology. But here's something that Washington said that reveals a bit of his philosophy about how he approached things. We should never be drawn into necessity to put anything at risk. I am aware that a retreating army faces many difficulties, that declining an engagement subjects a general to criticism. But when the fate of America may be at stake on the issue, we should draw out the war if possible. Now, by that quote, he was playing the Revolutionary War as an infinite game, meaning he was not seeking to win a single encounter. He was seeking to advance the cause that he was fighting for. He was seeking to keep the game going long enough until the other party in the game chose to withdraw. Now, I'm not suggesting that viewing our interactions from a leadership perspective with people on our team, with people in our family, with our supervisor, with our colleagues, I am not suggesting that our goal is to cause them to withdraw from the conversation and to just wear them down. That's not my point. My point is to take the idea of viewing a conversation more of an infinite game, meaning I'm trying to keep it going, than as a finite game that I'm trying to win, as a very productive strategy for shaping our mindset for how we engage with other people. When I view the conversation with another person in a finite game perspective, meaning I'm trying to win the engagement, I'm likely to revert to strategies like arguing a point or getting overly focused on a single issue, using shutdown strategies, using questions that back a person into a corner rather than invites the person into the conversation. I'm likely to try to prove the other person's wrong rather than win them to my perspective. I'm focused on getting my idea heard rather than the two of us coming to mutual understanding. If I shift that around to an infinite game perspective and realize that this encounter is one encounter of many in my relationship with this person, and remember an idea that Stephen Covey talks about in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that we are either depositing to or withdrawing from an emotional bank account in our interactions with other people. I want to view this conversation in its larger context, how this conversation affects our relationship, rather only how does this conversation affect this point or this project or this transaction with this person. I want to use this conversation as a way to, yes, come to agreement about an issue at stake. Yes, seek common understanding at the end of this conversation. And do it in a way that preserves and protects our relationship. I want to achieve both. I want the transaction of the moment to be as successful as possible. And ultimately, my real goal is to keep the relationship alive, to keep the conversation going so we can live to talk another day. If I take that perspective, I'll be careful of using any kind of negative strategy with the person, trying to win the point, back them into a corner, shut them down, any of those kinds of approaches. I'll ask questions. I'll engage in a way that invites their conversation. I'll draw them out rather than shut them down. I'll learn from George Washington that keeping the game going is better than winning this single encounter. Because if we keep the game going long enough, we really can win the conversation. In the context of talking like a leader, we win the conversation when both of us feel good about the outcome, rather than just one of us winning the point or walking away with the feeling of satisfaction that we made the other person see our viewpoint. What we want to do is borrow the idea from Simon Sinek that conversation, leadership, is an infinite game, not a finite game. In an infinite game, the goal is to keep the game going so that we can live to play another day. In a finite game, the goal is to win the engagement in a fixed time frame. And the reason this strikes me today is because this episode will be released on New Year's Eve 2019, a time when many of us are reflecting on the past year and looking ahead to the next, setting goals, reflecting, figuring out how to adjust our approaches, our strategies, our behaviors, our business processes to get better results in the year to come. And I think those activities are fantastic ideas. My encouragement is that we think about leadership less from the short-term transactional view of a given time frame and more of the longer time frame of the full engagement we're going to have with this person or this team. The years to come, hopefully, not the single interaction. So if you can learn to think of conversations, interactions, communication with your team, colleague, supervisor, family as an infinite game with no definite endpoint, rather than a finite game with a very specific time frame and very specific rules and very specific win or loss strategies or outcomes. If you'll learn to do that and think beyond this conversation, you can talk like a leader.
This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.